The rain hadn't touched Caldwell County in 11 days, but that morning, standing in the dust of the auction yard, nobody was thinking about rain yet. They were thinking about the goats. 27 of them, penned together the far end of Lot 6, hides pulled tight over their ribs, hooves cracked from rocky ground, eyes gone dull the way an animal's eyes go dull when nobody's looked at it kindly in a long while. Brush goats, cull stock, the kind of animals that show up at the end of the sale day when the good pens are empty and the only men left leaning on the rail are the ones hauling for the processing plant 2 counties over. The auctioneer barely slowed down for them. He'd already cut the opening bid in half once, and the silence that followed told him he'd need to cut it again. That's when a hand went up. Back row. Nobody expected it. The woman who raised it had mud dried into the seams of her boots, and a bidder's number she'd used exactly once that whole morning. She didn't look left or right for permission. She didn't hesitate. She took all 27. For a few seconds, nobody in that barn said a word. Then a voice from near the front, an older man, whether the particular shade that comes from 40 years outdoors, turned to the fellow beside him and said it loud enough for the rafters to catch it. Well, there goes her whole operation. The laugh that followed rolled to the crowd like something that had been waiting for permission. Even the auctioneer smiled before he brought the gavel down. Nobody walked over to ask what she'd seen in those animals. But before the summer was over, every one of them would want to know. Her name was Delia Marsh, and 18 months earlier, she couldn't have told you the difference between fescue and crabgrass. She'd spent 9 years in Ohio managing supply contracts for an agricultural co-op. She understood farming as numbers on a spreadsheet, tonnage in shipping windows, and price per bushel. She understood it the way you understand a country you've only ever seen from an airplane window. Then her Uncle Walt passed and left her 60 acres of hill ground in eastern Tennessee that nobody else in the family wanted. She drove out to look at it once, meaning to sign the listing papers that same week. She never signed them. The land was pretty in the tired way land gets pretty, a crooked line of cedars, a pond that turned copper at sundown, pasture that rolled soft over the hills. But underneath the prettiness, it was worn thin. Walt had run the same handful of cows on the same ground for 3 decades without rest, and the grass had given up trying. The dirt had gone hard as a parking lot in the places where the cattle always gathered. When Delia pushed a screwdriver into the soil that first week, it stopped cold after 2 inches, like the ground itself was clenched shut. She had some savings, a stubborn streak nobody had asked for, and as of that Tuesday morning, 27 goats that everybody else in the county had already thrown away. She was not a farmer. Caldwell County knew it, and Caldwell County watched the way small counties always watch. Not cruel, exactly, just patient. The way people get when they've seen plenty of hopeful newcomers arrive with notebooks full of plans and leave 2 seasons later with nothing but a for sale sign and a story the neighbors would tell for years. The man who'd made the joke at the auction was Ellis Pruitt, and he wasn't a villain either. He clawed his own cattle operation back on the edge after his father nearly ran it into the ground, and every opinion he held, he'd paid for in real losses. When he told Delia flat out, a week later at the feed store, that goats would strip her pasture to bare dirt by August, he believed it, because he'd watched it happen before. Delia just nodded, didn't argue. Somehow that unsettled him more than an argument would have. She wasn't ignorant of the risk. She just wasn't convinced the men at the feed store were looking at the same problem she was. And it would take a cardboard box in her uncle's cellar, swollen with damp, smelling of mildew and old paper, to show her exactly what problem that was. The box had been shoved behind a stack of paint cans, the kind of forgotten corner that only gets disturbed when somebody's clearing out a dead man's house. Inside, water-stained agricultural bulletins from the 70s, a few faded photographs, and underneath all of it, 2 spiral notebooks in handwriting, so careful it looked almost printed. They were Walt's. Grazing journals, dated 1968 to 1971, years before Delia had even been born, years before he'd given up on anything but running his cattle straight to the same pasture, season after season, until the land quit fighting back. Back then, it turned out, Walt had tried something different. He'd split his ground into sections, moved a small herd through them in turns. The notebooks were full of careful little observations. How long each section needed to recover, which corners of wildflowers came back in first, how the soil changed color as the seasons passed. And then, abruptly, the entries just stopped, mid-sentence, almost. Cattle prices had spiked that year. Delia would later learn, and the slow work of resting pastures had stopped looking worth the patience it demanded. She read those 2 notebooks 3 times that same night. The next morning she drove 2 hours to find a man named Everett Cole, 76 years old, a retired extension agronomist, whose name was scrawled in pencil in the margin of one of Walt's entries. He still lived on the same farm he'd studied for 30 years, and when Delia knocked on his door with the notebooks under her arm, he didn't look surprised. He looked like he'd been waiting for someone to ask. They sat on his porch most of the afternoon. Everett talked about soil the way some men talk about their children, with a kind of plain, specific tenderness that made you realize you'd never really looked at the ground under your own boots before. Soil isn't dirt, he told her. It's alive. Billions of organisms in a single handful, and every one of them depends on living roots to survive. Graze the same patch of ground continuously, and the grass never gets a chance to rebuild what's been eaten. The roots shrink toward the surface. The ground compacts. Water quits soaking in and starts running off instead. And none of it shows on the surface. Not right away. The land just gets thinner and thinner, quietly, until a drought comes along and drags the truth up into the daylight. But rest a pasture, really rest it, 30 days, sometimes more, and the whole process runs backward. Roots push down. 6 inches becomes 14. 14 becomes 2 feet. Those roots crack through the hard pan, open channels to the rain, and feed the exact microbial life that had gone dormant waiting for the chance. And goats. He said, goats weren't the villain everybody made them out to be. Used right. Moved often. Pulled off before they hit the roots. Given time to let the ground recover, they'd clear out the brush and briars competing with the good grass, without ever touching the deep soil life underneath. The grass that came back after them came back stronger than before, not weaker. Delia drove home in the dark with the windows down, turning it all over in her head. Within the week, she'd split her 60 acres into 7 paddocks, using nothing but electric polywire and a car battery charger. The goats moved every 5 days. Every paddock got a minimum of 30 days to rest before they came back through. She started keeping a notebook of her own. Within a month, without really meaning to, it had started to look a lot like Walt's. The fence didn't hold at first. It never does. A storm took down 40 feet of it in the second week, and Delia spent half a night wading through wet grass with a flashlight clenched in her teeth, counting heads by the shine of their eyes in the dark. A section along the tree line turned out to be grounded out entirely. She didn't figure out why until a neighbor's boy pointed out a fallen limb resting across the wire. And in the first month, a pair of coyotes took 2 goats in a single night, which was how she ended up driving 3 hours to bring home a Great Pyrenees pup she named Samson, who grew fast and slept restless, right in the middle of the herd, like he already knew what he'd been born for. By the feed store, the story going around was that she'd lost half her goats already. The real number was 2. But a good story never much cared for accuracy, and Caldwell County had plenty of time on its hands that spring. Ellis Pruitt drove past her place every Thursday on his way to the co-op. By the middle of June, he'd started slowing the truck down, not because anything looked remarkable yet, because something looked different. The goats were filling out. Their coats had gone from patchy to glossy, and in the paddocks they'd already cycled through and left behind. Something was stirring in the resting ground. A green coming back into patches that had been bare dirt since before Delia ever set foot on the place. Her neighbor, a quiet woman named Louise who ran a small cut flower operation on the next lot over, stopped at the fence line one afternoon and just stood there a while, looking. "What is that coming back in there?" she asked. "Native grass," Delia told her. "Some clover, too. Seed was probably sitting in that ground for years. It just needed the brush knocked back and enough rest to wake up." Small birds started showing up in the resting paddocks that hadn't been there before. When Delia pushed her screwdriver into the soil of the section that had rested through 2 full cycles, it went in 6 inches without any real effort. Then 8. The drought came in July, the way the bad ones always seem to, not all at once, but by degrees, like something slowly letting go. The rain stopped showing up. The sky turned the color of old bone by early afternoon most days. Ellis Pruitt's pond dropped nearly 2 feet in under a month. Pastures that had been grazed hard and continuous all spring across the county started going from green to yellow to a used-up brown, and by the first week of August, the hills along the state road looked scorched from a distance, like something had passed low over them and taken the color with it. Farmers started selling off cattle early rather than pay hay prices to feed animals standing on dirt. The feed store ran dry of hay twice in 10 days. Ellis sold off close to a third of his herd in one transaction, just to keep from watching the rest of them go gone in front of him. Delia's 60 acres stayed green, not because the sky had done her any favors. She got the same white heat, the same dry wind, the same rainless weeks as everyone else on that ridge. But her soil, rebuilt over one growing season of rest and root and rot, and rebuilt biology, was holding water the rest of the county's ground had long since lost the ability to hold. The organic matter down there worked exactly the way Eric Cole had described it on his porch that afternoon, like a sponge that let go of its moisture slowly, keeping the roots alive days after the surface had gone dust dry. Her goats were fat. Her grass was still growing. Her pond hadn't moved an inch. Ellis drove past on a Thursday in August and stopped the truck dead in the road. He sat there long enough that Delia noticed from the barn. Then he drove on without getting out. He came back that Saturday, parked at her gate, and stood there turning his hat over in his hands until she walked out to meet him. He didn't apologize outright. That wasn't the shape of the man, and she didn't expect it to be. But he asked, plain and serious, if she'd walk him through what she'd done and how. She did. Every paddock, every rotation, every inch of what the soil had taught her. By September, Louise had brought 2 people out from the county conservation office to walk the fields. 3 other farmers asked to borrow her fencing setup to try a rotation of their own. Somebody from the state extension office called about including her ground in a study on drought resilience. Some of the county stayed skeptical. Some just quietly stopped bringing up that summer whenever she was around. A few still slowed their trucks down on Thursdays, not ready to stop and ask yet, but watching. Delia never needed them to say anything. The ground didn't need it either. 27 goats that nobody wanted had done more than survive a summer. They'd helped bring 60 acres of tired, hard-packed ground back to life. Quietly, patiently, a long time before anybody thought to call a miracle. And maybe that's the whole of it. The farms that make it through the worst dry spells, the ones on the land and the ones in the life, usually aren't the biggest or the best funded, or the ones everybody bet on at the auction. They're just the ones where somebody did the slow, unglamorous work of building something worth standing on long before the world showed up to test it. Sometimes the thing everyone else is laughing at in the back row is the only thing that ends up saving the whole farm.